Hello, I'm John McKay, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Scarborough-Guildwood. And this is our latest podcast on you make a living by what you get, and you make a life by what you give. And I have as my guest the co-president of Masaryk Memorial Institute, Georgina Steinsky. And she has a very interesting story to tell. I have the great honor, actually, of going to Masaryk Town from time to time for various events. It is a hidden gem in Scarborough-Guildwood, but we're not going to tell anybody about it because otherwise it'll be overrun by people who want to visit Masaryk Town. But it is a gem. So Gloria, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, and it's Georgina, not Gloria, but that often happens. I get called various things.
How did I blow that? Oh, it says right there, you're Georgina. My goodness. Well, it shows you this really is amateur hour.
It all starts with G,
Yeah. So, Georgina, you came to this country as a young immigrant from Czechoslovakia in 1950.
Correct.
That was a huge wave. So there must be a pretty interesting family story behind that immigration. So can you share that with us?
Of course. I think in some ways our story is fairly typical of many immigrants from Czechoslovakia in that period. And in fact, that was the time when Masaryk Town was originally purchased in the 40s, and it really was a place where a lot of the immigrants like my family went. My own family were extremely wealthy capitalists, and that was a very nasty term in 1948 when the Communist Party came to power in Czechoslovakia. And my grandfather had already had his 5 textile factories confiscated by the previous government in 1945 under the influence of Stalin. And it became increasingly apparent to him that capitalists were not going to be welcome by the new regime and that he would somehow have to get us out of the country. So I've heard this many times as a child, how he organized a very dramatic escape in the nighttime with a person smuggler. We often hear about that now with these terrible refugee stories happening now. They were going on then too. There were people making money, exploiting people like my family, who would pay them to take them. In our case, this smuggler took us to the German border. And then we were in a refugee camp on the Bavarian part of Germany for about 9 months. And then my grandfather had a friend who was Jewish, who had come to Canada prior to the Nazi invasion. He had managed to leave Czechoslovakia before the Nazis invaded, and therefore was sponsoring people to come to Canada because he felt very guilty about the death of his family in the Holocaust. And so that's how we ended up in Canada. And we landed at the now famous museum, Pier 21 in Halifax. And my grandfather's friend had arranged for us to have a train. We took the train all the way to Toronto, and eventually my family settled in Toronto.
And Pier 21 is actually an interesting location. I would encourage anybody listening to this to go to Pier 21, and probably they could look up your family and the landing papers. Would that be correct?
Yes, they can. In fact, there's a young man of Czech origin working there as a historian, and people are welcome. I should warn people, you have to be the original refugee or have permission from the original refugee to look up those papers, given the privacy laws. But you can certainly look up. They will find your land. They will find your boat, and they can usually find your family.
I didn't have that impediment when I went there. I was at one point married to an Estonian woman, and her family had a equally dramatic exit from Estonia, and came over on a ship called the Waldock. And I walked in Pier 21 and I said, "This is the story that I heard from the family about the coming as a 300 Estonians on a minesweeper." He said, "Ah, that's the Waldock," and
Oh,
pulled
good.
out massive amounts of paper. And it was, I even saw
That's
my
great.
former in-laws'
Great.
signatures, etc. So,
Great.
wow, that's quite a story. How many people in your family came?
On that particular wave, there were about 10 or 12 of us came
Yeah.
in that truck that crossed the border, and yeah.
Hmm.
So
And
and
all came to Canada?
all came to Canada. Some of the next generation has moved to the U.S., but most of us are still in Canada.
Yeah.
And there were other parts of the family, as tends to happen with these emigrations, went to France and Switzerland. So I now have some people I call my cousins in that part of the world, and I've just rediscovered the relationship. So it's quite nice.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
Ancestry.ca would have a lot to tell you.
exactly.
Gee, have you been
Yeah.
back to the Czech Republic since?
Yes, I went back in 1990 because I was one of my career moves. I was hired by Tomas Bata of the Bata Shoe Organization out of government to negotiate with the Czech authorities about the re-entry of the Bata Shoe Company into Czechoslovakia, which ultimately became the Czech Republic. So my assignment was the negotiation with the government of the terms of re-entry, and then I ran the company there for a while. So I lived basically in Czechoslovakia or Czechoslovakia slash Czech Republic between 1990 and 1995. Relearned my Czech, which I had been forced to learn as a child.
Mm-hmm.
Retrospectively, being grateful to my parents for having forced me to speak Czech at home.
At the time, not quite so grateful.
No, not so
No.
much.
And did you get to go back to your grandfather's factories?
Absolutely. Well, we went to one of them.
Yeah.
The others I did not visit, but there were also a lot of other family assets, some of which we actually got back because
Hmm.
after the changes in 1990, the Czech government actually passed a law that said if you could show that there had been some private assets, not the commercial assets, but the private assets taken by the communists and could show you were an heir, you could claim those back. So my dad and I claimed some private forests that my grandfather had had, a beautiful historic palace that he had had built for his residence and his office headquarters in my hometown. We claimed back some apartment buildings in Prague, a lot of land around Prague. So yeah, it was quite the adventure to go back in the
I bet
1990s.
it was. Yeah. My former wife did the same thing in Estonia. Um,
There you go.
not such dramatic pieces of property, but still same. It's not like the law of the return. It's a law of entitlement or something. Yeah.
Well, they called it the restitution law.
Oh, okay. Well, that sounds perfectly reasonable. So you come here um, and um, and presumably get enrolled in schools. Where did you go to school?
I went to school. My parents bought a house in Leaside, which
Hmm.
at that time was basically a kind of a middle class working neighborhood.
Yeah.
And unlike many schools in Toronto today, a young man named Jerry Belomo and I were the only immigrants in the school.
Hmm.
I entered kindergarten not speaking any English, and Miss Harris, my kindergarten teacher, took me under her wing, and I think she just decided she was going to make a good little Canadian out of me.
Yeah.
And she not only made sure I learned English, but she spent a lot of time just trying to kind of help me in the school. And all my teachers were actually, at that time in Leaside, immigrants were exotic.
Yeah.
And so here I was, this exotic child,
Yes. Yes.
very well taken care of.
Well, they probably didn't appreciate at the time how exotic you are and how dramatic was your exit from your homeland. What
And I,
school, what university did you end up going to?
I ended up going to the University of Toronto
Yeah.
and studying history,
Hmm.
and then subsequently moved to Ottawa with my then husband. And about a year and a half into living in Ottawa, I joined the Federal Public Service
Yeah.
and kind of wrote as a historian, and then eventually rose through the ranks. And in 1985, when Brian Mulroney was elected, he had made a pledge that he would increase the number of women. This was in the very early days of women in senior positions, increase the number of women running large government departments. And
Yeah.
there weren't many of us around at the time who had had some experience at upper levels of the public service. And so I ended up, after a very interesting series of different assignments in the federal government, going in different government departments, running a department called the Department of Supply and Services, which today is combined with the Department of Public Works and Government Services. And essentially, I was on a big shopping spree, buying military equipment, all the IT for the government. We made all the government payments. I won't prolong this, but my favorite story is that in the capacity of being the kind of the bankroller of the government, the one who does the payments, I was called deputy. One of my titles was Deputy Receiver General, which meant that my signature was on all the checks. And my father finally, who was a bit of a Central European male chauvinist,
Yeah.
finally believed I had a job because he saw his daughter's name on his
Yeah.
pension check.
Yeah, I see. That is a good story. Yeah, my father had the view that that the only people who had real jobs in the world were farmers. Everyone else were pretenders of having jobs. So when I became a lawyer, that was a bit of a downgrade from what he thought a real job should be.
Work.
Who was your minister at the time? Or you probably had several.
I had several. My first minister was a woman named Monique Vezina, who was very, very francophone. I always thought she was a closet separatist.
Yeah.
And one of my first big issues we had to deal with was that she decided to overturn the recommendation of my department and myself to give a major contract for servicing what were then leading edge fighter planes. They were called the CF-18. And we had recommended the contract for servicing these planes go to Manitoba. And
I remember this. Yes.
She said, no, it's going to go to Quebec. And I said, well, Minister, if that's not our recommendation, but if you want to do that, you have to get your cabinet colleagues to agree.
Yeah.
And she did, but people still, you remember it, but
I remember.
People in Western Canada definitely remember it.
And haven't forgiven the federal government ever since. Bristol Aerospace, as I recollect, was the contractor. Yes.
That's right.
And they bitterly resent having lost that contract to a Quebec-based company. Okay, so yeah, you contributed your own level of separatism. Thank you very much. Yeah. So how long did you stay with the federal government?
I was in the federal government for a total of 17 years, and then, as I mentioned previously, I had this opportunity, and I thought it was really being a historian. I kind of saw how historic that 1989 moment was.
Right.
And when Tom Bata met me and approached me whether I would join him in the question of whether he would get restitution of his former business assets or what the conditions would be, the Czech government wanted him back. I felt this is a unique moment in history. You don't get chances like this to work within a unique
So for
moment.
those who are listening and may or may not recognize the name Bata and the Bata Shoe Company and the historical context of the name Bata really in the Czech culture. Do the thumbnail sketch of the.
Well, the thumbnail sketch is that the Bata Shoe Company was probably the most famous company to come out of Czechoslovakia. It was founded in 1894, and it really had a genius entrepreneur as its founder, who was the first Tomas Bata. And by 1939, they were a global company in about 47 countries, manufacturing, selling footwear. And for the Czechs, Bata was a great source of pride so that when the Berlin Wall fell, democracy came back, capitalism came back. They really wanted the Bata Shoe Company to be present back in the country, and it was a kind of a symbol of a return to a different world. And the Bata Company continues to exist today, and people in this city may know it may know the name because there is a Bata Shoe Museum, which has nothing to do with the company. It was founded by the wife of one of the Thomas Batas, but
It's on Bloor Street, isn't it?
it's on Bloor. It's at Bloor and St. George.
Yeah.
Very interesting museum. People are always surprised how interesting it is to go and see. For the younger generation right now, we have a whole exhibition about the future of footwear and sneakers, and it's an interesting place to visit. But that's
I,
the thumbnail sketch of the Batas.
I was listening to a podcast where I've forgotten which podcast it was, but the woman was talking about shoe coffins. Or sorry, foot coffins.
Foot
Uh,
coffins.
yes,
And
foot
those are
coffins.
shoes, or
That's right. That's right. That
well,
we are actually made as bipeds to be walking barefoot or nearly barefoot. And although barefoot or nearly barefoot in February doesn't seem to be an attractive possibility to me.
no, not in Toronto.
No. So so your life has weaved in and out of history,
Hmm.
and in and out, particularly of Czech and Slovak history. So, can you give me a kind of a rationale as to the split between between the Czechs and the Slovaks, and what was that all about? Because for those of us who aren't either Czech or Slovak or even East European, it's a bit mysterious that shortly after the wall fell, that the two countries went their separate ways.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I think that as with many of these things, it goes back much further in history. The There were a few things going on. First of all, the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, which was called Bohemia and Moravia, had always been somewhat wealthier and economically different than than Slovakia. Slovakia tended to be more rural. It was very, very Catholic. The Bohemia and Moravia had more of a mixed history in terms of religious history, going back to a major uh, 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 Protestant riot in a big movement in the 1400s. So the histories were somewhat different. And even in 1918, when the modern state of Czechoslovakia came together, uh, there were these differences had continued, and there was always some difference, but under the leadership of Thomas Masaryk, who was the first Czech president, and a Slovak leader named Stefanik, the country did come together into one. However, unfortunately, under the Nazi period, the Nazis exploited what were already some separatist tensions, and they set up a Slovak fascist state. And then when it went back to communism, Czechoslovakia was brought back together. There was a lot of investment, particularly in arms factories in Slovakia. However, there had always been an element of a sense that we're different, particularly on the Slovak side. And depending on who you talk to on the Czech side, there had always been a sense that the Slovaks are different. So the whole history was somewhat peppered with a sense of there are differences, although there were times of unity as well. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the two countries operated for 3 years, or basically 2.5 years. And at that point in time in Slovakia, the separatist forces perhaps became stronger, and there was basically a very gentlemanly, and it was two gentlemen, the two presidents of the at the time, basically because it was operated as a kind of federation. Um, they just came together, and it was fairly easy to split the assets. It was a very peaceful divorce. Uh, Assets were split up. Not a lot of upset on either end, and the two countries have since gone their own ways,
Yeah,
and
that's
are
it.
amicable,
Yeah,
and it
and
just
work on things together.
and
Yeah,
work on
yeah.
things
No,
together as
I
needed.
agree. Now, was the Czech president, was that Václav
That
Havel?
was no, the president at the time, it would have been Václav Havel, but I'm sorry, that was the two prime ministers that really negotiated the deal. And the Czech prime minister at the time was Václav Klaus.
Hmm.
And I honestly can't remember the name of the Slovak prime minister
Okay. Well,
who came together with
um,
him.
yeah, which makes it kind of an interesting local transition point here to Masaryk town, because Masaryk town was a Czechoslovakian
Correct.
creation at its inception, and my impression, you correct me if I'm wrong, is that it still operates for both the Czechs and the Slovaks with relative harmony, but you can tell, as I say, you can tell me whether I'm wrong or not. But tell the folks that are listening about Masaryk town, and in particular the unique role of Masaryk in the history of the Czech and Slovak republics.
Well, why don't I start with Masaryk himself? And
Sure.
that, of course, explains why Masaryk Town was named Masaryk Town.
All right.
Thomas Garrick Masaryk was the first president of Czechoslovakia, and he really was responsible for, in that period when in the first after the First World War, when all the peace treaties were being negotiated at Versailles. Um, he worked very, very hard to uh, take the movements of nationalism, which had been fomenting since the latter part of the 19th century on both the Czech and Slovak side, to bring them together into one country. And he was a very great leader, for not only for doing that, and you can imagine, you being in government, John, you understand what it is to make something like that happen, having to work in Versailles with all the different parties who were negotiating in the treaties, and it was a very, very challenging task. And then to go and lead the country and bring people together and create the new country and build it up and create the institutions of a new country. So Thomas Masaryk was very, very highly respected by many people. And hence, when people emigrated to Canada, a lot of them wanted came together, as many immigrant communities do. Certainly, the first generation that comes here, it's a source of comfort for them. And they were, in a sense, in exile, because most of them, not all of them, but many of them had left because of the same reasons that my family left, which was they were no longer welcome, or would have suffered had they stayed. So they bought. There were a group of them came together. It was a little earlier than 1948, but they bought this piece of land in Masaryk Town, which is quite a bit larger. It was an old farm
Hmm.
dating back to the latter part of the 19th century, and they purchased this land, and it was meant to be rather than everybody having their own cottage, it was a place where they all got together. I remember going there as a kid. The men would be playing soccer or volleyball. There was a restaurant. At the time, there was a functioning swimming pool. There would be various events that would be held for the community. And it was very much the idea that Czechs and Slovaks didn't differentiate. There had always been, among the emigres, there had been a Slovak movement, as a Slovak separatist movement as well, and some of those folks formed their own institutions. But there was a group of people who believed in Czechoslovakia as an entity, and that is still continuing in the tradition. Which I would say, if you carry forward the tradition of Masaryk Town, is that it's a welcoming place for Czechs and Slovaks, and quite frankly, John, others in the Scarborough community, because the Czech and Slovak community has never really located in one place, and there are not that many people of Czech and Slovak background who live in that neighborhood. So, for example, we know that the restaurant welcomes many people from Guildwood, for example,
Mhm.
who would have
It's a good restaurant. I like it.
would
Yeah.
have nothing to do with Czech or Slovak, other than that they might be interested in Czech or Slovak food, you know.
Yeah.
So
No, to be recommended, especially the beer.
yeah,
Yeah.
beer is Czech beer.
Yeah, exactly. And the two residences on the property are to be coveted because they are delightfully positioned to have a
Mhm.
great view of the Scarborough Golf Club. And just for people again who don't know, this is on Scarborough Golf Club Road. It's at the top of the valley, if you will. I guess that would be the northern part of the valley. And one building is situated to looks, I guess, west over I'm going to say the 14th hole, and the other one looks south, and it would look over the
The-
ninth hole or eighth hole or somewhere in there.
Possibly, but actually overlooks over the community, the kind of the housing around there more.
Yeah, well, if you're looking that way, yes,
Yeah, it
but if
depends
you're
which way
looking
you're looking.
south,
Correct.
yeah,
If you're
yeah,
looking south, that's true.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah, Scarborough Golf
delightful.
Club is our neighbor.
Yep, indeed. So you have, if you will, this is kind of like a full circle moment for you, and you've not actually left the community. You've weaved in and out of the community, but you now are serving on the board
Correct.
and having the co-presidency with Mr. Dubitsky. Um, so that's kind of interesting. That's kind of fulfilling, I should imagine.
Well, it's my mother in particular and my grandfather very much inculcated in me that I should be proud of my Czech roots. And as I mentioned, they forced my sister and me to learn to speak Czech. And uh, my mother taught me a lot about Czech history, and of course, I studied some of that myself later on. So yes, and I also think that as these things have changed since 1989. Masaryk town and the Czech and Slovak community were kind of in exile before 1989. Now people are free to go back and forth. And of course, in the same sense, there's much less immigration from these countries. So one of our one of our challenges is how do we serve the existing community? How do we, quite frankly, relate to the broader Scarborough and Guildwood community? That's kind
Mhm.
of one of the things that we're hoping to address in the next little while. In fact, they're also very welcome to come to our events. You've been to it before. We're having an expanded Czech and Slovak festival on June 18th. We're having 3 bands. We're having children's events. I don't know when this will be broadcast. It may be too late by the time this gets broadcast, but it's the kind of thing where we're trying to create a good community event where not only people of Czech and Slovak origin come, but others in the community should also feel free to come, bring their children,
People in the
enjoy it.
community also need to see the monument about communism there.
Correct.
Can you give a brief description, which is, in my judgment, one of the most moving pieces of sculpture that I've ever seen?
Well, I think that thanks for that segue, because one element of Masaryk town, given its history, is to remember that a lot of the people who founded it, and that there were many millions in Central and Eastern Europe, including Estonia, who suffered under communism. Uh, Many people did not have the opportunity to escape, or if they did escape and leave, in many cases they were persecuted beforehand, and many died. Many died in prisons. Many died in labor camps. So this idea of creating a monument at Masaryk town was so that we don't forget that history, because it's very easy to forget history as the generations move on. So there's a beautiful monument it's almost like a suffering.
Beautiful. I wouldn't use the
Well,
word
beautiful.
beautiful.
I guess artistic
Yes,
probably is a
yes,
better way to
yeah.
put it. It's a very artistic in very good taste monument there of a figure, a suffering figure, to remind folks that this is a very dark period of history that we need to commemorate. And so, as you know, when we have special events, we will lay a wreath there just in commemoration of the victims of communism.
Well, before I let you go, I would be remiss if I didn't get your reflections on the Putin war and how this plays not only in the diaspora communities, but how you see it in world history. And I'm calling on your skills as not only a historian but a keen observer of European history, and I can't help but think this stirs up some pretty profound feelings in the community.
Well, it definitely does. And in fact, Masaryk Memorial Institute has donated towards towards helping the refugees, and some individuals are doing things on their own. Obviously, this is, in a sense, a repeat of history, and particularly given the Russian element of this, the um, in a sense, the communist occupation of Czechoslovakia, and why a lot of people like my family had to leave was because of the Stalin-led um, occupations, I guess one did. And certainly that would be our take on it. And so therefore, we are the community generally is, of course, shocked and concerned about what will happen in that part of the world, and is trying to do something to help. And I think what we're grateful for, speaking more narrowly from our Czech or Slovak perspective, is that the Czech Republic and our Slovakia are part of NATO, and that hopefully that will protect those countries, because you'll remember, or people may not remember, but in 1938, not Woodrow Wilson, the British Prime Minister basically kind of
Churchill. Churchill.
No, it was pre-Churchill. It was
yeah, I know you mean the appeasement guy.
The appeasement guy, exactly.
Yes. Oh goodness.
The famous Munich incident where he talked about this. Who knows about this tiny little country, Czechoslovakia? Why should we worry about them? So, in a sense, one hopes that
Chamberlain,
that's right, Neville Chamberlain. And there's a very good movie about that now called Munich. Anyway, so you're absolutely right. It's evoking concern, and hopefully with NATO that there will be an adequate protection for the other countries, and also hopefully Ukraine will not be overrun by Russia, and that there'll eventually be a peace settlement. I read the papers, I watch the press like you. Who knows when that's going to happen, but let's hope it happens soon.
Yeah, I doubt that there is any peace settlement with Putin. The only way he goes out of Ukraine is in a coffin. And I regret to say that, but I just don't see that there's any off ramps for Vladimir Putin. He has to win or he has to lose, and that's it.
Well, we will see. And,
yeah.
Let's hope maybe there is an off ramp.
I would like you to be right. I would like you to be right.
I know.
Yes, I just returned from Vilnius, and there's no sense of anybody there that thinks anything other than this is a war, and you have to win wars. Otherwise, we go back to the dark days of communism, Stalinism, Tsarism, all of the horrors that Russia has perpetrated upon its border nations. So, anyways, that we should have a second podcast about that. And let me leave you with this thought. As you think about reaching out to the community, the Scarborough-Guildwood community in particular, but Scarborough, Toronto at a larger sense, it seems to me that people like Georgina Steinsky speak with special authority because of their history, because of their ethnicity, because of their experiences. And it's a voice, or they are voices that need to be heard in our community, in a real platform. And maybe Masaryk Town can be a platform for the expression of some of those voices to the larger community. As I say, I was in Vilnius, and the difference in how they think about Putin's war and the distractions that we have here in North America are profound. As I say, they think that the World War III has already started. We're more worried about whether the Toronto Maple Leafs will ever win a Stanley Cup. It's kind of a pathetic dialogue. So,
John, if I could just make a quick comment on that, and I know you're wanting to bring this to an end. I mean, I appreciate people have their lives and they have their own particular backgrounds and histories. I just think it's important that in these momentous events, that we not forget the history, and in particularly
yeah,
for Canada and North America and Europe, that we not forget the history of the last century, because we really do want to avoid repeating it.
yeah. Which is a good way to end a podcast that works on a quote from Churchill, because the make a living by what you get and you make a life by what you give is directly from Winston Churchill. And he saw history with some clarity that others didn't see. And I don't know where the current leadership is in terms of seeing things with clarity. I had a great meeting with a German MP on Wednesday, and the Germans get it, the Finns get it, the Swedes get it. I'm pretty sure the Czechs get it, the Poles get it. Canada, I'm not quite so convinced, but
Well, and I
anyways,
hope we can, and in Scarborough Guild, where there's also a diversity of a lot of other people who don't come from Europe or
right.
originally, and hopefully we can learn from some of their experiences as well. So.
Well, indeed, we've lived with those experiences on a regular basis, and I guess the big distinction here is that many of the conflicts that are represented by the various elements of the community don't have the same capacity to be so disruptive to world order and to our way of life. So I don't know whether that, I don't know, as Canadians, I don't know if that point is actually sunk in. Anyways, this isn't actually how I wanted to end this podcast, but
well,
it's still a really good conversation.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for the opportunity. And since the role of Masaryk Memorial Institute is to not just be a place for people of Czech and Slovak origin, we hope that others will come and learn about Czech and Slovak culture with us.
And I hope they do, and I hope they take advantage of the park, and I hope they take advantage of the restaurant. And thank you for not only your volunteering with Masaryk Town, but also your willingness to integrate into Canadian life and your willingness to share your unique cultural background. Thank you, Georgina.
Okay, thank you, John.
Take care.